In statistics, variables can basically be categorized into two different categories. They're either categorical variables or they're quantitative variables. Categorical variables are sometimes called qualitative variables, and quantitative ones are sometimes called numeric. I'm going to use the ones that are in purple, categorical and quantitative. Just know that you might hear them in other classes in other ways. I just find it gets really confusing when we call them qualitative and quantitative because it's hard to tell the difference. So first, categorical ones or qualitative ones, you can imagine, have something to do with categories. So they're basically splitting variables into categories. So for example, what is the highest math class you've taken? Someone's answer might be calculus, someone's answer might be algebra 2, someone's answer might be calculus-based statistics, someone's answer might be differential equations. Those are all just different categories, right? So everybody's variable goes like into like one of the boxes, one of the categories, or one of the qualities. We're like naming qualities off of something. Quantitative ones or numeric ones are basically a number. And now I'll give a little disclaimer in a minute that they're not always the only ones. Just because it's a number doesn't mean it's quantitative. But quantitative ones are something like a number, like how many siblings do you have? What's your height? What's your weight? What's the average wait time in line? Those kinds of things are quantitative because they're numbers that make sense to average. They make sense to add together and then average. Even if the average number of siblings is 3.7 and 3.7 doesn't make sense as a person, it does make sense to average and say, well, the average person has 3.7 siblings. And so quantitative ones are numbers that make sense that we could do math with them. We could say like that is, twice as much. You have twice as many siblings as I do. Whereas with categorical, say like the highest math class, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to say like, well, you took a class that was twice as high as my class, because even though they may actually have an order, which would be called ordinal, which is not something we're going to worry about, but they may have an order like, okay, algebra 2 is down here and, calc 4 is up here. That doesn't mean that we can like add them together and say, well, the average math class that most people take, that doesn't make sense. We can't just like add them together, right? So they're categorical. Now here's the disclaimer. Just because something has a number, just because a variable has a number, doesn't mean it's it's quantitative. So think about jersey numbers. Think about if we said, what are the jersey numbers of all of the students on the high school basketball team? And we took that data. Would it make sense to average those? Would it make sense to add them all up and find the average jersey number? Like, of course not. That doesn't make any sense. So they are not quantitative. They're just categorical, because if you think about it, although it's a number, it's still just a label, right? It's a label. That person is number 52. It's a label for that player. It's not a numeric value of any sort, like age or weight or height or anything like that. The same goes for phone numbers or addresses. Phone numbers are numerical, right? They're all a number, but again, does it make sense to like add them together and say the average phone number in Montana is? No, of course not, right? It's just a label. The phone number is a label for that phone line. So that would still be a categorical. Okay, so long story short, categorical ones are labels for something, and quantitative ones are variables, are numbers. So let's look through all of our examples and decide what kind of variable it is. Well, we already talked about this. This would be a categorical variable, going from the bottom to the top this time, just mixing it up, So this would be a categorical because we're labeling the math class. Marriage counselor is interested in whether or not someone stayed married. Again, categorical because it's a yes or a no question. It doesn't make sense to say like the average of whether they stayed married or not. Like it just doesn't, you just don't add them together. They're not numbers. Same with the pollsters, and for the candidate, that's categorical because it's a yes or a no. The coffee shop manager, this one is actually quantitative because we're looking at the time that people wait in line. And so maybe I wait for 10 minutes and someone else waits for 2 minutes. It does make sense to add those two together and average them and say the average person waited 4 minutes in line. Did I do my math right? So that totally makes sense to average the values of the amount of time someone stayed in line. Again, the cardiologist, this one is a quantitative variable because it does make sense to add them together and their numbers. This one, the DOT, would be a not qualitative, well, it is qualitative or categorical because the answer is yes or no. Is the vehicle out of state or not? And finally, the tensile strength, this one would be quantitative because it's a number and we make sense to say the average tensile strength is such and such.